The sun was sinking low behind the ragged hills when Thomas Hale rode back to his ranch, dust rising in soft plumes behind his tired horse. It had been a long day of fencing, repairs and quiet. Miles, the kind of silence that presses too close on a man who's lived too long without company. He had seen storms, cattle drives, and the war that took more from him than it ever gave. Yet nothing had prepared him for the sight waiting by his north fence. She stood there half-shadowed by dusk, her hair tangled with dust and wind, her clothes torn as if she had wrestled with the desert itself. For a moment he thought she was a ghost, some spirit risen from the old Apache lands that bordered his property. But then she moved, weary, real, breathing, and he saw the marks of flight on her, bruised knees, scratched arms and eyes that burned with both fear and pride. When she spoke, her voice was low, rough with exhaustion but edged with command. "Get inside first," she urged, glancing toward the horizon. "Then talk." The words carried a weight he didn't understand, but he obeyed, drawn by something beyond reason. Inside the ranch house, the air was thick with silence. He poured her water, and she drank it in trembling gulps before straightening, every motion guarded, deliberate. He noticed then the fine beadwork on the remnants of her clothing, Apache handiwork, unmistakable, and the knife at her belt, chipped but sharp. "You're far from your people," he said quietly. She met his gaze without flinching. "They are gone," she replied. "The soldiers came, I ran." The pain in her voice was raw, yet there was no plea for pity, no weakness. Only the strength of someone who had lost everything and still refused to fall. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the distant echo of hooves. Thomas felt his gut tighten. Whoever she had fled from might not be far. "How many?" he asked. She shook her head. "Enough." He loaded his rifle without another word. They stood together in that dim light, a rancher and a runaway, two strangers bound by danger. Neither had invited. Minutes stretched into hours, and when the night deepened, no riders came. The woman, her name still unspoken, sat by the fire, eyes tracing the flames as if reading the future in their dance. "Why did you tell me to get inside?" Thomas asked finally. Her answer came soft, almost a whisper. "Because I saw what follows men who try to be heroes. They die too soon." Her words struck him harder than he expected. She had seen too much, and so had he. For a long time neither spoke. The fire crackled. The horse in the stable shifted. The desert night pressed close against the windows. When at last she rose to her feet, she moved with quiet determination, gathering the worn blanket he offered and draping it over her shoulders. "I will go at dawn," she said, but Thomas shook his head. "You won't last a mile alone. Whoever you're running from, they'll come looking." She turned, her gaze steady. "Then you shouldn't help me." He almost smiled. Too late for that. Something in his voice softened the sharp line of her mouth, and for the first time, she looked less like a fugitive and more like a woman remembering what it meant to be safe. Outside, the first coyote called, its cry cutting through the dark like an omen. Neither of them slept. The rancher kept watch by the window, the woman by the fire. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, as the sky bled from black to gray, Thomas heard her whisper something in Apache, a word he didn't know but felt, a prayer maybe, or a goodbye. When the light finally touched her face, he saw the scars more clearly, the dirt and blood that told of days spent hiding. Yet beneath it all was a quiet strength that unsettled him, the same strength that had carried her across miles of desert to his doorstep. She stood ready to leave, but he stopped her. "What's your name?" he asked. For a heartbeat she hesitated, then said, "Nayara." The name lingered in the air like a song. "Nayara," he repeated softly, as if testing the taste of it. She turned toward the door, sunlight spilling over her shoulders. "You should forget it," she said. But he knew he wouldn't. He watched her step into the dawn, her figure cutting across the golden field, and something inside him shifted, something he thought had long turned to dust. The ranch felt too quiet without her. He didn't know then that before the week ended, before the dust settled, and the danger found its way back to his door, he would call her his wife. Perfect. Here's chapter 2 of your story, written in the same cinematic tone, flowing continuously from chapter 1, around 800 words long, fully punctuated, and without breaking the immersion or adding any external commentary. 3 days passed before Thomas saw her again. He had spent those days in uneasy silence, patching fences, feeding cattle, pretending the desert wasn't, whispering her name back to him every time the wind changed. The horizon stayed empty, but his mind didn't. Each time he turned toward the North Ridge, he expected to see her, the woman with fire in her eyes and silence in her steps. And then, on the morning of the 4th day, as the sun rose behind the barn, she returned. Nayara rode in on a horse that wasn't hers, bareback and bruised, her hair matted with dust and blood. Thomas dropped his tools and ran to her before he even knew he was moving. She didn't speak, only slid from the saddle into his arms, her breath shallow, her skin burning with fever. Inside the house he laid her down, fetching water and cloths, his hands trembling more than he wanted to admit. Her wounds were not new but deeper than before, cuts across her arms, a bullet grazed near her shoulder, and eyes that told of a chase that hadn't ended. When she finally woke, her first words were not of herself but of warning. "They found me," she whispered, voice rasping. "They will come here." Thomas didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. He had seen the look before, in soldiers cornered by enemies they couldn't name. He simply nodded, checked his rifle, and bolted the door. The ranch that had once been his quiet refuge was now a fortress. For 2 days they waited. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried stories of rivers and red canyons, of dances by the firelight and songs that had no English names. Thomas listened, not out of curiosity but reverence, realizing how small his world had been compared to hers. One evening, as he sat by the fire sharpening his knife, she looked at him and said, "You could still send me away. Save yourself." He met her gaze steadily. "You told me once not to be a hero," he said. "I'm not. I just don't walk away from someone I've already let in." Something in her broke then, not in weakness but in surrender. For the first time since she had arrived, Nayara smiled. It was faint, uncertain, but it was real. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, filled with the kind of peace only two people who've both seen too much can share. The attack came at dawn. The faint drum of hooves shattered the morning calm, followed by shouting voices carried on the wind. Thomas was already outside, rifle in hand. He counted 5 riders, men in torn uniforms and dust-colored coats, faces twisted by greed more than hatred. Mercenaries, maybe, or deserters hunting bounty. Nayara joined him at the door, her face calm, her knife glinting in the rising light. "Stay inside," he ordered. She shook her head. "You don't own the fight alone." The first shot cracked the air, splintering wood from the barn wall. Thomas fired back and chaos erupted. The echo of gunfire rolled through the valley, scattering the horses in the pen. 2 men fell before the others retreated behind a line of rocks. Nayara moved like the desert wind, silent, precise, circling wide through the brush until she came behind them. Thomas didn't see her strike, but he heard the shouts that turned to silence soon after. When the smoke cleared, she stood there, knife in hand, her face streaked with dirt and determination. It was over. Thomas lowered his rifle and walked toward her. The weight of the fight hung heavy between them, but so did something deeper, an unspoken bond forged in fear and fire. He reached out, brushed the blood from her cheek, and said softly, "You shouldn't have come back." Nayara looked up at him, eyes steady. "If I hadn't, they would have found you instead." For a long moment they stood without words. The desert wind tugged at her hair, and the morning light turned everything gold. The barns, the fields, the very air they breathed. Thomas felt something shift inside him again, something he could neither name nor deny. He took her hand, rough and calloused, and said the only thing that made sense. "Stay." She studied him, searching his face for deceit, for weakness, for the kind of promise men often make when fear fades. Finding none, she nodded once. "Then I will stay," she said. "But if you call me your wife, it will not be in your tongue. It will be in mine." He smiled faintly. "Then teach me." And she did. That night, by the soft crackle of the fire, she spoke words older than his language, older than the fences and fields around them. He repeated them until he could say them without breaking their sound, until they no longer felt foreign but sacred. In her world, a bond was not written or signed. It was spoken in truth. And when he spoke it, She reached across the space between them and rested her forehead against his. No vows, no ceremony, just a promise made in the quiet heart of the desert. Days turned to weeks. The ranch healed, and so did they. The fences stood tall again. The horses grew fat on spring grass, and the nights filled with soft laughter instead of silence. To the few travelers who passed by, they were simply the rancher and his wife. No one knew her story, and Thomas never told it. Some secrets, he believed, belonged to the land itself. But sometimes when the wind was still, and the stars burned bright over the wide plains, Nayara would whisper her old prayer in Apache, and Thomas would answer with the only word he had learned perfectly, her name.